afternoon, everyone. This is Barbara Three Crow with Turtle Talk Live. It's November 23rd. Before I begin today's program with exploring the mysterious and real-life X-Files and personal accounts of abduction and some of the First Nations legends of the Star People, I feel drawn to reflect on an issue of significance regarding the upcoming holiday, Thanksgiving. If you have tuned in to Turtle Talk before, you know that I always begin by saying that I'm speaking to you from Turtle Island, where the great river, the Mahikanituk, flows both ways. But did you know that there were up to 112 million First Nations people here in the U.S. and Canada, known as Turtle Island, who had thrived for thousands of years before Columbus stumbled upon this continent, and following that, a massive invasion of Europeans who were seeking asylum from religious persecution and war. And records show that during that time, 80 million native people were murdered as well as died as a result of diseases. And it was also documented by a Jesuit priest that in the Americas in the mid-16th century that 40 million native people were murdered by Spain alone. And today, there are 5.2 million First Nations people in the U.S., Alaska, and Canada. I wanted to begin with that information to not only clarify where I'm speaking to you from, but where my own relatives, the Nantichoke, lived along the Great River and throughout Turtle Island. But I also want to bring attention to those First Nations today who remain on Turtle Island, and about the genocide upon their ancestors that occurred during the colonization of America. And also as a segue that will shed some light on how some First Nations people feel about the upcoming holiday of Thanksgiving, and why to them this is considered a national holiday of mourning. And I pulled out this article to reflect upon that. And some would say, why be so dark about it? And the response from the head of the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribal Council says it's real and it's truthful, and it was a Holocaust. Now, Cedric Cromwell is a Wampanoag, and when he sits down with his family for a meal on Thanksgiving each year, the day holds a unique kind of significance. He is the chairman and president of the Tribal Council of the Mashpee Wampanoag, the same Native American tribe that first made contact with the Pilgrims who arrived in Massachusetts in 1620. While the Wampanoag welcomed the Pilgrims and helped them ensure a successful first harvest, they were nearly wiped out by warfare and disease that arrived with the settlers. For Cromwell, Thanksgiving is an opportunity to give thanks, but also to highlight the way that his people suffered at the hands of the settlers. We are Americans as well, and so even today, he says, I sit down at Thanksgiving with my family. I do have that Thanksgiving meal on that day, but it gives me an opportunity to speak to my children and the family about the truth of the day and why that day is important to give thanks. His perspective illustrates the dual meaning that Thanksgiving holds for some Native Americans. The day is both a chance to ceremoniously express gratitude, a practice that existed in Native American culture long before the Pilgrims arrived, and an opportunity to highlight the challenges that the community faces today. Just as some are pushing to recognize Indigenous Peoples Day on Columbus Day, there is an effort to use the Thanksgiving holiday to bring an accurate representation of Native American history into the mainstream American culture. Cromwell said that it was important to both give thanks and highlight the brutal history Native Americans have faced. And again, some would say, why be so dark about it? And he says it's real and it's truthful and it was a Holocaust. And that Holocaust must be shared and communicated so that we ensure that mankind does not do that to each other again. We know this world is made up of travesty and tragedy. We also know that this world is made up of a lot of goodness and hope and honesty and integrity. On Thanksgiving, between 700 and 1,200 people will gather in Plymouth, Massachusetts for a national day of mourning to educate people about the vicious history of the treatment of Native Americans and the issues affecting them today. The event has happened since the early 1970s, when Frank James, a Wampanoag leader, was barred from giving a speech that portrayed Europeans unfavorably at an event celebrating the 350th anniversary of the Pilgrims' arrival. There's nothing wrong with having a meal with friends and family, and I would say especially for many of us where our families have survived genocide, it's so important for us to be able to sit down with each other and to be grateful that we have food and to enjoy spending time with each other. Mattawan Monroe is a co-leader of United American Indians of New England. It's the group that organized this event and that has attended this every year since the 1980s. And he says that the real underlying issue is the mythology. There's a view that we're this big melting pot country, or there's a view that the natives and the pilgrims lived happily ever after, and the native people just evaporated into the woods or something to make way for the pilgrims and all of the other aspects of the European invasion. And all around the country, schools continue to dress up their children in little pilgrim and Indian costumes, and the Indians welcome the pilgrims and they all sit down together. And everybody says, "Isn't that cute? That's so nice." But that's not at all what happened. Monroe said that her group encourages both Native Americans as well as non-Native Americans to attend the National Day of Mourning, where she expects speakers to touch on what happened to Native people, but also to focus on contemporary issues like high dropout and suicide rates among Native American youth. It is said that the suicide rate among Native Americans between ages 15 and 24 is 2.5 times the national rate, and the graduation rate among American Indians and Alaskan Natives is the lowest for any racial or ethnic group, according to a 2014 White House report. Monroe added that she expects speakers to discuss efforts to get sports teams to change offensive mascots' names and to express solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, and also to highlight the disproportionate number of Native Americans who are killed by police. After the demonstration concludes, some who attend will leave to go and have a Thanksgiving meal with their friends, while others will stay for a feast and social planned event by organizers. Ramona Peters is a tribal historic preservation officer for the Mashpee Wampanoag, and she said that highlighting the horrific treatment of Native Americans won't stop her tribe from having a celebration to give thanks. It's something that we did long before the Pilgrims arrived, and that we do multiple times all year, not just on the day recognized as Thanksgiving. The celebration started on the weekend before the holiday, with some Wampanoag going to church dressed in regalia to pray, and then to a traditional fire, where members of the tribe can gather to give thanks for the season. And this event can last multiple days. While Ramona Peters says that she's angry at the way Native Americans were treated, she's proud that the United States has a holiday even to give thanks. As far as actually extending friendliness, I don't want to be embarrassed or ashamed of that as a Wampanoag person, she said. It's part of our culture, and we had been that way long before the Europeans arrived, and we remain, and we will continue with the way of our people, which is to give thanks every day. So now I'm going to continue now with what I had planned to bring in today, and as I said, I just wanted to start off with that because we're getting close to that holiday, and I know that some people do have issues with that, and I just wanted to bring it to the attention of the listeners as to maybe understand a little bit more of why some really struggle with that day, that celebration, and to shed some light or some truth upon what really happened. So this is, I'm going to continue with what I've been doing here for the last couple of weeks and discussing unusual close encounters and persons who have had abduction experiences. And I'm starting out here with this diverse subject, and those who believe in alien visitors to our planet and those who do not. But there are many people on this planet who earnestly claim that they have been visited by aliens and have been abducted and taken off this planet Earth. Even that they have gone to, been taken to alien home worlds. Now again, I'm investigating this with you and sharing this information with you for these last couple of weeks because I have had my personal experiences, and I have met many people, others who also have had these types of or similar experiences, and I think that it's very important that we explore what is really going on, or possibilities, certainly. And I do know that First Nations people throughout the world have their own accounts and history, and it goes back, way, way back in time. So these are accounts may vary, and the one thing that they do share is a conviction in what they saw. In other words, what they experienced and the impact it had on their lives. These are going to be some accounts of a few people here. This one person, she's a New York photographer. Her name this New York photographer, Stephen Hirsch, 63 years old, has interviewed and photographed many abductees. And he says, I don't want my audience to have any preconceptions about these people before they see his images and read their words. And I must say that what I've noticed about looking at the people here that are being interviewed, every one of these people have striking eyes, and that's something that I talked about with the Star Children. There are certain things that indicate this a star child, for instance. Now, I'm not saying that these abductees are considered star children. I don't really know that. But I did notice their striking eyes. Their eyes are very light blue or very light green, every one of them. It's really quite interesting. And one thing that is known with an indicator of a star child, for instance, is that they are known to have compelling eyes. And that's just one little faction here. Now, the interviews barely break the surface of what is going on in their lives or in their minds. And I'm not an analyst, and my questions are not intended to find answers, but to allow people to tell their story. We've become desensitized to the TV soundbite, and with these projects we can stare at the picture, we can stare into their eyes, we can feel their angst, and it's a very simple approach. There's no distractions. And here the abductees tell their stories in their own words. And this first one, her name is Cynthia. And she looks to be about a woman in her mid-60s. And she starts out with, I got to meet numerous types of beings. When I was in my 30s, I found out from my father the truth about a government experiment that I was part of, in which they were using other alien DNA to create me. I also have been on the ships most of my life, off and on. I've had lots of contacts. Most of my contacts began when I was a teenager, although I had it also when I was very young. I had been taken, and I've been taken on ships quite a bit. I've also been on various different types of ships, motherships and transporter ships, and I've got to meet numerous types of beings. I've met salamander beings, and I've met greys, various different types of greys. I've also met the blue Arcturians, which are incredible. They all have their own personalities and their own purposes. So I've met blue Arcturians, and I've met Andromedans, the Assyrian warriors of light. I've met the Sirius Nephrons. I've also met what is called the cat people that are from Sirius. I've met many. I've actually seen people that can shapeshift from human looking to reptilian. And I think I've experienced that myself, actually. And she's going to continue here. Cynthia says, as far as the abductions, I've had numerous of them where they've shown me around various ships. They've also explained to me about the hybrids and about the starseeds that are here on planet Earth, why they're here and how they're here to help humanity. My job primarily is to awaken the starseeds to remember why they're here on planet Earth. I have communication with beings of all different races. I've had communication with reptilians as well as those that look like werewolves. They look like werewolves on steroids. I've also had communication with the human-looking ones, with Ashtar, with Sananda, with Archangel Michael. I've also been able to help others go to the ships. Part of my mission is to help people get to the ships that need to be on those ships. There's a lot of what you would consider updating when it comes to with what's happening to planet Earth. And when strategies have to change, then many of the starseeds that are here on special missions are taken to the ships, where they are then informed of the changes in the strategies and so forth of what is going to be happening in the future. And I know that in the case of Whitley Strieber, for instance, and others that I've met, and even myself, we call this the secret school, that sort of that you are really actually being in training or being taught or indoctrinated. And she's describing that particular event, I believe. Cynthia continues here, I've never yet ever met a being that was malevolent. I've always met the benevolent ones. I've never experienced unconditional love till I've met them face to face and had conscious contact with them. They have taught me the importance of living with unconditional love and working with the light of Source. This is the power that rules the universe. That was Cynthia's sharing of some of her experiences. And Jeffrey is another one. It happened 11 years ago in St. Louis, Missouri. He was at a dancing bar, or a dance bar rather, and he went there with a few friends to have some drinks. And he said that this guy comes in out of nowhere, and he was a dark, like a person of color, but he had a very strange voice. And he knew things about me that no one in around me or my friends even knew. He knew things I was doing. He knew when my parents were going to die and what they were going to die of. And then he tells me he's here to abduct me, replace 49 chips. And Dr. Lewinsky, one of those hybrids, gray hybrids, was actually going to do this operation. He was known as Dr. Lewinsky. And they were going to take me aboard a flying saucer. I thought I escaped this guy, and I did a psychic reading the other day with a woman, and she told me that I was abducted, that I actually was abducted, that I was swept up for perhaps 3 hours, and they did exactly what they said they were going to do to me, and they took me back to that bar and woke me up, and I lost 3 hours in time. I had no idea. That's all I remember. They took my memory away from this particular abduction. It was a human hybrid. He was a man of color, but he had a strange voice that wasn't like anything I've ever heard. He sounded also just like a human, though. And Jeffrey says that he remembers his father telling him that he was abducted by aliens in the 1950s. But he's dead now, and he died of cancer just like the alien said he would. He died in 2001, after September 11th. The alien said my mother was also going to die in 2011, and she did. And now there's Jill. She looks to be about in her late 20s. These beings that call themselves pure light beings, and they were a collective of beings that were here to assist humanity, and they came through with this message that had been shifting consciousness for humankind at this time. I sensed the wholeness of them, that there were many, and they came through with information every time. And I also felt other beings that were present as well, and some of them were similar to the classical beings, but kind of silvery light. They would be doing things to my aura and to my energy, and I could feel them. I could see visual images of them activating something in my conscience. And this is how I perceived it. They basically said into my mind that they were activating things so that they could communicate better with me. There are beings from everywhere, and it's very fascinating. Some of them were also the Zeta Reticulans. The messages from the Zetas are basically that they're helping us in our evolutionary process, and all of these events that are happening, that people are experiencing, such as abductions, are to help us to evolve. Help us evolve as a species into a more luminous being, a lighter being. Our actual DNA is being shifted, so our physical bodies are actually becoming lighter in frequency, and they're helping us to do this, she says, and to activate abilities that we have inherently, but that have been basically been shut off and not activated. So we have this extra DNA that we're not using, or another level to our DNA that we're not using. And we are supposed to be, as a species, moving in evolutionary speaking into a lighter dimension, actually, moving into a lighter dimension. I guess, and I just interject here that we do talk about this time, this prophecy that speaks of this fifth hoop, this fifth age or fifth world of enlightenment. And I just want to remind everyone that I've spoken about that before. And so she continues here. It says they also say that it is an awareness, a new level of awareness that we are meant to be moving into. So all of the beings, Zetas, are on one level or another from different perspectives. And the Zeta beings that often are experienced as abduction experiences are here specifically, they were asked to help with this process because they're actually experts in genetics, and I guess she's saying manipulation, genetic manipulation, but it's really not what they themselves would call it. It is what we would call it, genetic manipulation. These beings have the ability, or they've developed the ability, to work with genetic structures. It's beyond what we think of as genetic because there's an energetic level. Now, I'm not a scientist, so I don't know what to really call it, but there always comes that message that there's an energetic component to this. And I'd just like to add that energetic, we could say frequency, because we've been talking a lot about this time. What I understand is that we are meant to be at this time, at this stage in our evolution, is to beginning to understand and to work with the ancient wisdom of energy or frequencies, to really begin to understand that this is what we really are, what we consist of, are energies and frequencies, as does everything in creation. So perhaps this is what she's describing here. Now this next abductee is Joyce Lynn. She looks to be in her, I guess, mid-50s. And she says, so she must have been with other people. We were taken to an underground base near the Sedona area. And at the underground base, my friend and I were separated from the rest of the group that had been abducted, which was my 2 daughters, my husband, and another woman that was staying next door. My friend and I were seated in kind of these egg-shaped seats, and some kind of apparatus was put around our head, and there was this long cylinder kind of device that had a blue, looked like a blue flame that was coming out of it, and they put this up and around my head, around this other golden device, and then an alien came in. It was a mantis, what they call a mantis being. And they said that there was this little teardrop kind of, this kind of looked sort of like a pendulum upside down. And they were asking me to move it with telekinesis through a hoop, and that literally jumped through this hoop pretty much, and I couldn't do it. So the mantis helped me then to move this. It's like a little pendulum through a hoop that was, she says, hanging before her in the air. All right. So then they did this blue flashing something with a light, a blue flashing light, and then they said, now you try it. And they wanted her to do this. I guess they were testing her to see what her abilities were, and if I was able to move it through this hoop. And I was told at that time that they were upgrading my pineal gland for intuition so that I could have more psychic ability. And I do want to again remind listeners that talking about over these past weeks, that people who have been abducted often say that their psychic abilities are, they notice that their psychic abilities are accelerated. So perhaps this is happening to a lot of people. Now, Sebastian is a lot younger here. He looks around 19, actually, 20. And he says, it was 3 years ago I saw this ET. It woke me up in the middle of the night while I was meditating. And he says they exist. If some could go like this and open your eyelids while you're meditating. Okay, so I'm going to clarify here. He apparently in the middle of the night was meditating, he says, and they came and opened his eyes. And he says, while you're in a deep place, it looked like a little kid, this being, except it had big eyes. It looked just like a little kid, except it had these large eyes, a small nose, and a little mouth. Now I'm thinking that because Einstein was right about something, how there's different dimensions and different realities and stuff, I'm thinking they went through time. And if you know what I mean, if they're out there, if they know all this and they have all this technology, what are the odds of them coming back? They didn't probe me. They didn't do anything. They just opened up my eyes. It was kind of crazy, he says, because before that I was just asked for something. Apparently he asked for something like that to happen, just for proof. Okay, so this young man was asking for proof of something, and then they came, and he said, and it happened. I was a little bit scared at the moment because it was something really crazy. And he said it just disappeared. Just left and just disappeared. He said in his closing statement, he said, you think what you want, and then it happens. It happened to me. Now, Jeannie is a woman here who shares her experience. She said, anyway, this particular night was around the time of the full moon, and the Hale-Bopp comet was very prominent in the sky. And I had just come home from a firewalking ceremony, so that was an intense evening, and I kind of awakened in the middle of the night with feeling this weird heat down around my sexual area, and I was waking up going, what in the world? And then all of a sudden I could feel this long skinny bony fingers drawing circles on my right ovary, and I felt the paralysis, and I thought, oh no, they really are here. Now, I'm not sure how I saw them. If it was, tuning in and seeing them on whatever level. My room looks dark, and I always sleep with my light on. I've done that since I was a child. So I'm realizing they're with me and the energy feels different. It was totally unnerving to me to recognize that they really were visiting me. And I could see there was a smaller gray on my right-hand side and a slightly taller one on my left. And I remember telepathically saying, "Don't do that. I don't want you to touch me." And I asked him 3 times. It did not stop, so I'm not sure if it was my astral arm that came out, but I reached over and I grasped his long, skinny, bony fingers with my left hand and said, "I asked you not to touch me. Please don't touch me." That's when I noticed the grays on each side of my bed looked at each other, and I thought, they're gonna knock me out now with that light again. She says that she has been on ships, either driving them with somebody who was a well-known abductee, or I was in a huge mothership one time when I was being taken and guided by a taller gray that had on a bright red robe. He's more or less like my teacher, she says. Then I went into this conference room, and there was all these different beings from wherever, and then there was a seat that I knew was just for me. So I sat next to this being that had a body that looked similar to, I want to say like something like a an animal, like a skin of an animal, and it had that shape. And then he had just a round head, and when he looked, he had tiny skinny arms and legs, and he looked at me, and I heard this energy. I could see it go, and I laughed because I knew he was saying hello to me. "How have you been? I haven't seen you in a long time." And Sasha. Sasha is a male, probably in his 60s. I was lying, breathing deep and fast to the powerful, evocative music, and there I was. My consciousness was in the middle of this huge dome-like structure. The inside of the structure was white, and then there were coves in it that were big enough for people to sit in, and they were sitting cross-legged, some people, and some of them wore white robes and some of them had long hair, but they were all humanoid. There were some I couldn't quite tell what they were, but I got the feeling they were a type of human. Some of them were huge, and some of them were smaller, and they were all in these coves, or little hollows, I guess you'd say, carved out of this wall. And it was all part of this huge dome. And the atmosphere in this place was absolutely beautiful. It was golden light. And the background was white, like it was whitewashed. And it was a place, it seemed, for meditating on peace and on love. And Lisa, I guess I'd say about is in her early 30s, and her experience, she speaks about there was a knock at the door, and when she opened it, there was a gray being standing there, and this being handed me this small baby. I looked up to him, and he handed me a second one that shouldn't have been there, and she woke up screaming and so angry, so apparently she's having a dream. "Come back." She came back with, after she woke up, she came back feeling bruised and felt and saw bruises that shouldn't have been there. And I'd like to tell myself that these were just dreams, but somewhere inside myself I know it was more than that. Nancy, I think, is our last experiencer here. In the summer of 1961, when I was 12 years old, I was at my girlfriend's house, and we were playing, and her father yelled for us to come in outside. He wanted us to see something. When we walked outside, we immediately saw a giant silver craft. It was silently hovering above a tree. It had red, green, and white lights that I thought at the time were rotating, but I realized they were pulsating. I want to say, as I read this, I had described to you my first sighting here in part of Turtle Island, here in the Hudson Valley, 1950. I think it was around 1954, 55. I saw it with my whole family, and again, it was also a giant craft, and it also had red, green, and white lights. I may have had other colors, but it also had lights around the outer rim. So I saw something very similar in the 1950s. Now, someone in the neighborhood called the police, and 2 policemen came, and my father actually brought a telescope out, and he asked me to look through the telescope, and I said, "Why? It's right there." I didn't even understand why I would even look through a telescope. It was so close. And then there was a car coming down the road, and there was a tree here, and a craft here, and a car coming down the road, and as it got right underneath the craft, a beam of light came out of the bottom, and it went right to the roof of the car. And as soon as it touched the car was totally immobilized. I just remember screaming and being excited and jumping up and down. And I remember tugging on one of the police officers' arms and saying, "Do something, do something." After that, I remember being home and my mother and father telling me not to talk about this, to forget about it, hoping that I would forget about it and that it would just go away. So for 50 years, I never shared it with anyone, not with my family or friends or anyone. 6 months ago, I met Dr. Harry Wellness, and I told him my story because he was a ufologist, and I knew he would believe me and not think that I was crazy. He found a regression therapist for me, and I had no idea. I just wanted to remember the incident more clearly. And at the end of the first regression, I remember seeing that my body was rumbling. This was a word I never used. My body was rumbling and waving to the low hum of the craft, and that was the end of that first regression session. In the second regression, I actually remember being aboard and a procedure that was performed on me, and there were 3 grays, and they performed a laparoscopy on me, and in 1961 in the medical field that there were no laparoscopy during that period. They weren't even discovered yet. They explained to me that they wanted to see inside. They described themselves as teachers. They promised they would get me home safely. I remember in that regression that as the craft was leaving, they let me see them leaving, and they wanted me to see them leaving. The reason being that they promised, and they telepathically told me, "See, we told you we would get you back safely." And that was important to them, to relay that message to me. In the third regression, I remember communication that I had. I called him Mr. because that's how we refer to adults. So as a child, I referred to them as Mr. and Mrs. And I remember my conversation as I was leaving the craft. And he corrected me that it was called a ship. And the reason it was called a ship was that it goes in the water as well as in the air. And I watched how the doors shut. They shut. The way they shut was they wrapped around All the instruments that they used on me when they did the laparoscopy were retractable, and they all came out of the walls. It was all very neat and clean. There was nothing in there. It was just like a silver white floor, a silver table that I was on. 3 gray beings. One, the pilot, looked like a normal, anybody's dad. I said, "Mister, why did you let them hurt me?" And he said, "Your pain was perceived." Now, I got really mad at that remark. I realized that my pain was perceived, that they didn't hurt me. They didn't want to hurt me, but I was watching the needle and seeing the needle, and my pain was perceived. I remember the first night that I got home after I was taken, staring out my bedroom window forever, it seemed, and wishing for them to come back. I said, "Please come back. I'm here. Come and get me." Now, this was her remembering when she was a child, her experience when she was 12. And I found it interesting with my own experience with my whole family standing. We first sighted the ship coming up out of a hidden valley across from our home here. And in the Hudson Valley, it is actually known as the UFO capital of the world. Many, many sightings here. And I remember seeing the ship rise up and just hovering a little bit, and then it started to move across the sky. And as I described it, it was a large, very large disc with a small, I'd say like a cap on the top of it. And there were all these colored lights around the base of it. And we ran downstairs and got my parents, and we all went outside and stood there and watched it go across the sky. And 1954, 1955, and from that day on, no one in my family ever discussed what happened. It was as though we were mesmerized. It was very odd. And I did say that about 9 years ago, I decided to stop and talk to my sister about this because all of a sudden I realized that all those years and we never talked about it, and I thought that was odd. And I visited her, and and during our conversation I just brought it up again. I said, "Do you remember that time, that summer in 1950s we saw the UFO?" And she said, "Yes, I do." And so I knew then that I hadn't dreamt it, but the question still remains as why no one ever discussed it. And I've had that experience numerous times with people that I have been with and other occasions who have had sightings, and nobody ever discusses it. It's just as though you see a great big ship hovering over you, the most bizarre, incomprehensible, experience, and no one talks about it. And some of it may be that you're sort of maybe mesmerized. Maybe there is an abduction, like this young girl just described. She only found out through being regressed. And a lot of people only find out. They have a vague memory of something, or maybe they have a sighting, or maybe they have lost time, but they're not sure until they are regressed. And often a great percentage of people are regressed, and these abductions come through. So it's either my family was mesmerized, or our brains are overloaded with something incomprehensible and you can't identify it to anything, so you just shut it off. That, I think, goes on too. We don't have anything to refer to, actually. That circumstance, that amazing experience. It's not it's not something common. although it really seems to be common, but it's not something that is known. Especially in the 1950s and 60s, you didn't really talk about these kinds of things either because, you'd be called crazy or weird or that you were hallucinating, but then you have your whole family with you. And like that other abductee that I just read, a little couple above this one, said her whole family and even the neighbor were abducted. There's many stories like this. And now I get to Camille. Camille is probably in her 40s, and she's speaking about an early abduction. I had a sighting with my boyfriend. We were walking the dog, and the dog was barking at this squirrel that had run up a tree, and we were looking up, but we were looking at the squirrel. And there was this was in the Silver Lake section of Los Angeles, and we saw this thing in the air that was black, and it was moving, and it was a bright blue sky day, and I remember looking at him and saying, it's a UFO. And blue light had come through my ceiling. It was this very particular turquoisey kind of blue, and it was a very solid, like a column with like a bottom, but it didn't flare out. It was like a solid beam. And it came into my room. Okay, so this is the second experience she's sharing here. Once she was in her room. It came into my room, and when it touched me, I was frozen, and I curled into a ball, and I went through the ceiling. The next thing I know, I'm in this white, misty room, and I'm on a table. I saw this row of beings to my left, and they were very tall. They had white robes on with high collars. They had some kind of emblem. And I wanted to say that it was like a triangle inside of a circle. I'm not sure. They had big white heads and big black wraparound eyes, and they all looked the same, and I was quite terrified. Now, Vivian here is an older person speaking about his experience. Me and my partner decided we were going to go for a walk up on Bell Rock in Sedona. Bell Rock is known for being a vortex or an energy vortex. I didn't know what that meant. I just thought that we would go up there and feel some energy changes or something. My partner doesn't feel anything, so we basically were going for a walk in a nice area and to see if we could feel something. I had no idea there was any connection with alien activity there at all. It didn't even cross my mind. We had to walk a distance, maybe 3 miles, to get there. But I started to notice out of the corner of my eye a figure next to me. And the figure, we call them shirt boxes, because if you can imagine a man's shirt box, it's that shape. Except that the thing is about 4 feet tall, and it's got little sticky legs, and it's got 2 eyes and something that's a little off-center and kind of looks like a tiny beak for a mouth, or I'm not sure, but that's what it looked like. It's made of white plasma material in some kind of square membrane, and it's lit up. Anyway, it appears to me about 4 feet tall, something like SpongeBob. So SpongeBob was walking with me, and I'm getting tired. I'm feeling myself get very tired. I'm just going to hold here for a minute because this is kind of interesting that he's referring to SpongeBob as and some type of alien, and yet now we have this SpongeBob cartoon. I find that very intriguing. Some connection there. Now I'm getting very tired, and I said, I don't think I'm going to make it to Bell Rock today. And SpongeBob says, or the figure next to me says, by the way, we communicate telepathically. I've never ever heard a voice. SpongeBob says, yes, you are. You're going to go. All right, I'm going to go. So I walked a little bit farther, and I said, you know, I really am getting tired. And again, SpongeBob says, no, you're not. You're going. You're going. And so he answered, all right, I'm going. So I go a little bit further, and I'm extremely tired now, and I turn to SpongeBob and I say, look, I don't know who you are, but I think I'm done. You're not done, said SpongeBob. And he starts pushing me, physically pushing me from behind. And I'm really nervous, and I say, oh my God, all right, I'm going. And then I notice there's another one of these guys. Now there's two of them, and they're walking with me. And another one, and I walk a few more, maybe 10 or 30 feet, and there's 10 of them now. The whole thing is so bizarre. I don't know what to think. But I am walking. I continue walking, and there's so many surrounding me now. And then there's more, and there's more, and by the time we get to Bell Rock, there are literally, it seems to me, hundreds of these guys. And I see other human beings walking around, and nobody sees them but me. These people are laughing and singing and dancing. They are the happiest, most loving little creatures, and I ask them, why me? And they say, you're one of us. In the back of Bell Rock, there's a stargate. There was a pipe going up. I could see their little bodies were being sucked up in the vortex in the pipe. They were being sucked up into the heavens, it seemed. I had an experience with one of those little gray square boxed, now I can call it a SpongeBob, but it was a long time ago. It was around 1961 or 62, actually, and I've never really shared this too much with people because this was an abduction of my son, and through the window came one of these square, gray creatures. It looked to me like a robot, like a small robot about 4 feet tall. And it came from a great ship, which I thought originally was the moon, because it was... So here's how this happened. I'm going to share this with you. You know how sometimes we have a dream, or we think it's a dream, but it is so real, and that when you wake up, you feel that, well, I guess you could say you're kind of like confused because you think you had a dream, but in fact you feel that it wasn't a dream, that you know that it was not a dream. I suppose you could say instinctually it's a gut feeling, or we just know. And we kind of argue with ourselves even. We kind of like, because what we're talking about is something really bizarre or frightening, disturbing. So of course we want to think it's just a dream. And yes, we do have some disturbing dreams. We have nightmares, and we know they're nightmares. But there are those moments, there are those times when, at least this is my experience, perhaps you can identify with me, that there are times when I know that what I had experienced in the night was not a dream, but it was factual. So I'll just say that during the night, something happened where I I found myself in the upstairs bedroom of my son, who was an infant, and I was at the window. And it was so bright out. The whole room actually was really bright, really lit up, and I looked out the window and I looked up, and I was looking at what I thought was the moon because it was so huge and so bright. It was exceptionally huge, unusually huge. And as I'm looking up at this out the window, I'm thinking that very same thing. This is the moon, but it's so huge. It was hard to comprehend. In my mind, I'm looking out the window at, which I've done certainly throughout my life, looking at the moon. This was closer, I'd say, larger, and brilliantly bright. And I suddenly saw something that seemed to be coming from that moon that I now, after years, realized it was actually a mothership, probably. But it was something coming toward me, and I looked, and I started to get anxious, and felt myself getting anxious, and I saw this something coming closer and closer and closer to the window, and I went further into the bedroom, and I hid behind the dresser. I was terrified. And something came through the window, and I'm looking at it, and it was what I thought was a little robot, about 4 feet tall, 3 to 4 feet tall, squared off and grayish, square head, and so on. And the way this man is describing this characters here, this SpongeBob, is really very, very identical. And this was very traumatic. And it went to the crib and took my son and lifted my son up in its arms with its little face. My son's face was looking back at me. I ran to the window as it floated out the window towards this great ship. And next thing I know, I'm in the hallway looking downstairs, and there are numerous military people in my living room. Military-looking people, dressed in some sort of military uniforms. And the next thing I know, I'm waking up in the morning and remembering in my mind that I had a terrible nightmare. But then also the other realization that suppose and perhaps, and yes, it seemed so real. And I didn't want to really say that it was real. For many, many years, I believed that I had had a really bad dream, a nightmare, and didn't quite understand it until I met, I guess I was at a star being, or star, Lakota Nation's star being conference in Colorado. A lot of elders, a lot of people were there, and I was talking to Floyd Hand. It's Lakota. Floyd Hand, and I told him this experience, and also Barbara Marciniak was there, and we were sitting at a table together, and I said, I have to share something. I'm not quite sure, but I'm just compelled to share this experience. And they looked at me and listened to everything I said, and they said, your son was abducted. That's an abduction. And they described the soldiers, the typical abduction experience with many who say there were military-looking types in their presence or around, and so on. And so, you know, I know that I had those experiences when I was a child. I had my first remembering experiences when I was 4. And they do say that it goes through generations. And my one granddaughter, when she was 3, she started drawing these incredible drawings, amazing drawings of beings, unusual beings and ships and weird stuff. And I thought, okay, you know, what do you do with this? And I know my experiences have been quite profound, and I know that they have been teachers to me. And my son won't talk with me about this. I tried to talk with him. He says he doesn't want to know. Okay, I can understand that. So I'm just sharing this with you because of this talking, sharing this about this man seeing these, what he calls SpongeBob. And uh, um, yeah, it's very, very, very familiar. And so I'm just going to take a little break here. Thank you for sticking in with me. I know that some of these accounts and disclosures may seem pretty out there. Very difficult, I suppose, some of them to really comprehend or even really relate to. I Because I've had some unusual experiences in my lifetime, not just with what I described to you, but other experiences, that I often say that when people tell me their stories, I always say that I listen, and even though it might seem unbelievable or so on, I just say, well, I've had some pretty unbelievable experiences myself, so I never say to people that's impossible or that's crazy, or, well, not that I don't say that's crazy. I probably could say that's crazy, because, well, how else are we going to describe things like that? In our world, these things do seem bizarre and crazy and incomprehensible and nearly impossible, I suppose, but there is a great mystery. I always say there's a great mysterious, and I just want to continue here with personal accounts of Native Americans and what they call star people. And the speaker here is saying they've shared stories from their Cherokee grandfather, experiences that he directly had, and some that were passed down by his side of the family. And here he says, I have heard stories of giants in the Bible with 6 digits, stories of aliens and alien hybrid offspring with 6 digits, mutations, you name it. I always have to flash back to being 7 years old and listening to my grandfather's stories. Now, my grandfather was a World War II Navy frogman, pre-SEALs team member, and he ran into 3 people, human men in wetsuits, all of who had 5 fingers and a thumb on each hand and 6 toes, while clearing a beach in the Pacific. He would place charges on underwater shore blockades and scurry on shore with nothing but a file-like knife and a wire, like a piano wire, to take out Japanese military sentries and hide bodies, and take an ear for proof of encounter or a kill, they call it, and then they'd move in for recon and then back out to the surf and then to the waiting boat offshore to bring him back to his command. Now, my grandfather reported the people that were there to his commander. He said the men looked like they were Mediterranean. They were short, 5'5", about his size, and stocky, with short black military haircuts. There was no water or aircraft visible. They were perfectly human, except for the extra digits and shimmering purplish wetsuits. He was in the Navy for quite some time and had lots of interesting stories. In high school, I interviewed him for an assignment, and the teacher said it was the only tape he listened to all the way through because it was so extraordinary. Granted, Native Americans are known for their stories, and he was a full-blooded Cherokee, but even after he left the old religion and became a Christian, and then he became a minister, he did stick to his stories. After the program's experiences, I was forced into lineage. I am not going to doubt him for a second, but I realize how fantastic of a story it is, and am fine with doubters. This is the same grandfather that told me of an encounter on the reservation of being by Osage, near Osage Lake, and encountering 2 blue-green aquatic beings, one adult and one adolescent, after exploring an off-limits and sacred area with some other curious native children. This would have to be in the early 1930s. I don't think he counted their fingers, though, and it's off topic anyway, but just an interesting story. His grandmother told him stories going back generations of our family having similar experiences. We have something that kind of runs in the family, I guess. It's be it a metaphysical, tangible, otherworldly, or just plain psychological. And he says he has no idea why he's been sharing this stuff lately, but feels that it's important. Now, I'm going to go to an interview here with Dr. Artie Sixkiller Clark. She's written a book about the stories and native people's stories of the Star People. They're untold stories of American Indians. And during the interview, Clark talks about how a spiritual worldview affects the accounts that she's collected. And she's being interviewed by an Alex. And Alex says, if we unpack these experiences with American Indians that you're talking about, we assume going in that there's a different spiritual orientation. I think we assume, whether this is true or not, that in American Indian cultures there's a very different set of givens. In other words, what would you say about that? Is this true? Is that a misconception? And how might that play into these accounts of encounters with alien beings? And Artie Sixkiller, Dr. Artie Sixkiller says, well, I think again you have to separate tribes. There are some tribes where it's forbidden to even speak the name of a dead person, where in other tribes they believe that when someone dies, they stay with them for a year, or their spirit stays with them for a year. Their spirit remains with them for a year, and then after a year they hold a ceremony to release that person. They have ceremonies where they can speak with those who have passed over. They have ceremonies where they can speak with the ancients, or where the ancients come to get to them and give them knowledge and answer their prayers or their questions. So it does depend on the tribal group, and it is difficult for me to say, as a general rule, there are these spiritual connections, and there definitely is with some of the tribes. There's no question about it. Some of the tribes actually talk about the trip across the Milky Way. That's when you die, you cross the path of the Milky Way. You've got a common theme there, that the cosmos plays so much a part in afterlife and death, and the ability of the deceased that they never really do die. They just move on into another dimension, and that they can come back and they can communicate with the living. And Alex says, I just think no matter what subtle differences you might have in that worldview, I think a worldview that incorporates this spiritual dimension puts you in a completely different place in terms of dealing with the UFO phenomenon. And Dr. Artie Sixkiller responds, and she says, I do too, because Native people on a whole are accepting of it. They aren't skeptical of it. So if you approach it from a perspective that it is part of the universe, and that it's nothing to fear, then that's one view. But to be skeptical of it and not believe what you've seen, or to deny that it occurs, is a totally different worldview. Today we welcome author and professor emeritus, and this is the introduction here, and I'm going to continue with what what Alex is interviewing here. Dr. Artie Sixkiller tell us about your book. And by the way, I don't have this book, but if you're interested in it, it is Dr. Artie, Ardy, Killer, Six Killer Clarke, Clarke, and a book about personal accounts of Native Americans, Star people, and the Star people, if you're interested in finding that book. Okay. Now, she says that first I came to Montana State University, and she worked there in the multicultural education, but the center did what I would write grants. That's what she was doing, and she had gone out to one of the reservations in Montana, and she met with a group of students. Now, the person who helped her out on site invited her out to dinner, and after dinner he said to me, "Do you have some time? I want to show you something." So he took me up in the mountains above his village, and he parked his car, and he reached over and he got a pair of binoculars, and he said to me, "If we're lucky, they'll come." And I said, "Who will come?" And he said, "Well, the ancestors." So we sat on this boulder and we watched the night sky. And he told me stories about things that had happened to him and his wife, and his interaction with star people. Well, I had heard these stories when I was a little girl as well, so when I left the reservation that night, all the way back to the university, I was thinking, I've heard these stories, he heard these stories. How many other Native people have heard stories and have stories to tell? So she began collecting stories, and over time, she collected almost 1,000 stories in a 20-year period. They ranged from stories among Native Americans in the 48 states and Alaska, and because she grouped Hawaii with the South Pacific group also. Now, many of their stories were very similar to what I was finding throughout the South Pacific, she says, including Australia and New Zealand. And then she focused on the Maya in Guatemala, Honduras, and Mexico. And although I did have stories, she said, that came from the Zapotec, the majority of the stories came from Central America and Mexico and did involve the Maya people. That's how I got started, she said. She basically put her research away at the university. And she said when she was on the reservation, she had lunch with a group of women. I was still trying to decide whether I wanted to take this job or not because of 5-year commitment with the university. She felt it was a very long time. It involved a lot of travel and a lot of time spent away from home. So as I was having lunch with this group of women, we began to talk. And I don't remember how the subject of UFOs came up, but I began to tell them some of the stories that I had collected. And one of them said, "Well, what are you going to do with this?" And I responded, "Probably nothing." And she said to me, "Well, you can't do that. This is part of our oral history. You have to put this down so that people will know." And so then she obviously thought about this, and she determined actually to retire from the Montana State University and decided to write the book. And so she decided not only to write that book, but also more. One on the Maya and the indigenous people in Central America and Mexico, and one on the indigenous people in the South Pacific. And continuing with this interview, Alex says to her, "It sounds like you certainly have a lot of material. Before we jump too far ahead, I thought the first part of that account that you just gave was rather interesting, that these stories immediately resonated with your own personal history. If we pull that out of context, I don't know that most people in the United States today or in Europe or in the Western world would at all relate to the idea of being connected to the star people. And what do you make of that? What did that bring to your mind, and what had you done with that? And Dr. Artie Sixkiller says, as I was growing up as a child, my grandmother told me a story that the star men came to Earth and they lived with the sun woman. The sun women were the women of Earth. A time came when the star men had to leave the Earth, and the women of Earth were upset. So a council was held, and it was decided that those who wanted to stay could stay behind, and those who wanted to return to the stars could return to the stars. So my grandmother would say to me, you are a descendant of those star people and the people of Earth, and that all of us have a special plan for this Earth and for that reason. So for me, it was a story that I was told, and as I grew older, of course, I put these stories away. These were the stories of my childhood. When I became an adult, it had no impact on my life until I met this individual who told me his personal story. And of course, that brought back all of these stories of my childhood that my grandmother told me. Alex says, I think that gets at something that's right below the surface of this book, because one of the reasons we get excited about this book is to hear the stories from Native Americans, is that we think, as non-Native Americans, that there's something different about this culture, something different about their orientation to the world, different, that their worldview is different. And maybe that's true, and maybe that's not true, but yet I'm sure that it's both. But I think we have to be careful with how we unpack that, don't we? In other words, especially you as someone who has spent your professional academic career in both worlds. At Montana State University in academia, but also in working with indigenous people. How do we approach that with sensitivity, but also with a desire to gain the benefit of the cultural differences? And Dr. Artie Sixkiller responds and says, I think that's the thing I was always sensitive to. First of all, I didn't want to be branded at Montana State University as some psycho professor who was out there advocating beliefs in UFOs. But at the same time, in the Native community, I wanted also to be credible. I think that was the key to my success with Native people, is that what I did is I just put feelers out. I just was there in a quiet, listening way. I didn't go and attempt to coerce anyone into telling their stories. Some of the people, as I revealed in the book, I'd known them for 25 years before they ever told me their story. It was that waiting and watching, and even though I was part Native myself, there was that credibility test that I had to pass before the stories came forth. I hope that that shows in the book that the people who confided in me were people who trusted me. And Alex asks the question, do you have an example from the book where that was the case, where someone didn't come forward for a long time and then they came forward with a pretty amazing story? Yes, I think the story that Harrison tells of the craft that crash landed on his grandfather's ranch in a remote section of the reservation, and the survivors, how they lived there until they were rescued sometime later. Harrison took me to the ranch. He showed me where the event occurred. He told me about how, when he was a boy, he had boarded the craft and what he saw and what he felt. His grandfather, he wanted to remove things from the craft and his grandfather wouldn't allow it because he said that it was sacred. And then having the Corps of Engineers come in at a later time, and they built a dam which literally destroyed any evidence of the craft. His grandfather always believed that as they were excavating the land there, that they had discovered the craft and had taken it away. Now, this was back in the 40s, and obviously when I talked to him about it, he said there were very few cars on the reservation at that time. He said people would stand beside the road and just watch this equipment go by because they were so enthralled and fascinated by the size of the equipment and the vehicles that were passing by. So they could have removed everything. His grandfather always felt that was what had happened. But his grandfather was also pleased that he had kept it a secret, that he had somehow protected them, meaning the beings, from the outside world, and that they had lived there free of observation and free of detection on his land, and he was the one who had done that. Now, I had known Harrison for 25 years. 25 years. I had gone into the reservation as a consultant. I was sent there by the university because the school district in the community was attempting to get a bilingual education grant funded from the federal government. They had a number of children in the school district that did not speak English. They spoke only the native language. And Harrison resented that. He was a cultural person and the one that everybody turned to, so he resented what he considered university interference. It took time to gain his trust, and over the years we became close and we became friends. But still it took him 25 years before he told me this story, and I have no doubt whatsoever that what he told me was true. And Alex says, well, let's get to that. I think that you have a certain credibility that comes through, not only with Native American people, but in your work. A long-time, highly regarded academic who is not only familiar with the university, but is working with government programs and has the credibility that goes with that. I do think it's interesting in a couple of ways. It sounds like you were the only person who really could have written this book. I mean, it takes a certain tenacity to stay with this thing for that long, but also the kind of trust that's required. What comes through is that these folks who you collected these stories from don't fit the normal profile of people who are putting forth a UFO story because it was the most traumatic thing in their life, or because they have some kind of ulterior motive. No, it sounds like there was a different agenda here in terms of these people. A lot of them have incorporated it into their life just fine, and they brought it out because you were there, right? Right, Dr. Artie Sixkiller says. It was a story that they shared, perhaps with their family and their friends. Some of them had never told anyone else. I think just my presence, and when they told me the story, I never tried to interject any personal opinions into what they were telling me. I let them tell the stories without judgment. I'm a social scientist. I'm not in the hard sciences, so I wasn't demanding in terms of, well, where's your proof? And you've got to have some kind of proof. No, I wasn't looking for that. You tell me your story. You tell me what happened, and I will listen. And Alex says you did something that's much more valuable. You just gathered a lot of these first-person accounts. When we really sort through them and sift through them, we can start looking for the same kinds of patterns that let us know whether they're reliable accounts. I think that's a lot better than tracking down some photos of or little remnants that someone has. I don't want to say that because both can be valuable, and you do have some first-person experience that you had with trace phenomenon and all the rest, and all of that is good. Well, I think both approaches are valuable, but I think that hard science often criticizes social sciences. I've had some of that. I didn't set out from the perspective of trying to attack or criticize or delve into motivations. I just recorded the stories. I think because of that I got some very honest, open accounts of what actually occurred. Of course, I think the trust that came along with that was the guarantee that I would not reveal the identities of the individuals. Down the road, if some of them want to come forward and say, I'm the person in Dr. Clark's book, well, that's fine. I did commit to anonymity, and I intend to honor that. Many of the people who actually told me the stories have crossed over now. And these stories go back 20 to 25 years and more. Alex says, what's been the reaction from within the Native American community about the book? And she answers, nothing. I haven't heard anything from the Native community. Anything positive, like they want more stories, or negative, like, gee, I wish you wouldn't have brought that out? And she responds, I haven't heard anything from the Native community. I've had a couple of emails attacking me because I used the term American Indians in the book instead of Native Americans. And these emails were saying if you were really a Native American, you wouldn't call Indians American Indians. Although in the book, in the very front of the book, I explain why I used the term American Indian. Several years ago, back when I was still in academia, there was a group of us who were Native researchers who decided that we were no longer going to use the term Native American in our discussions in general about Native Americans because we based it upon the fact that the term Native American was increasingly being claimed by those individuals who were born within the United States, regardless of their ethnicity. So when we would say we were Native American, somebody who was not of American Indian heritage would say, well, I'm a Native American too. I was born here. So what we decided to do, along with the award-winning journalist Tim Giago, who was the founder of the editor of the Lakota Times and Indian Country Today, and also Native Sun News, is we decided that even though Indian is a misnomer, for generic purposes, we were going to use the term American Indian because any politically correct thinker who believes Native American is the preferred identification tag for any tribe is actually wrong. We prefer to be called Lakota or Northern Cheyenne by our names, but if not, American Indian is an acceptable term because of the Native American. And I think rightfully so. People who are born here have the right to consider themselves Native Americans. So there have been some attacks along the way toward me, but obviously the people who attacked me hadn't read the book, or at least not my explanation. What's been the reaction from within the UFO community? Well, if you talk about the UFO community, the people who are in power, and the people who you see their names at conferences, there's been total silence. Now, Whitley Strieber has certainly been positive, but I'm not sure he's a part of that community as such. My leaders have been just absolutely unbelievable. The accolades and the reviews and comments and emails I get have been not one negative from any of them. I do think that the UFO phenomenon, the ET phenomenon, is really an important part of what's evolving as our culture, our understanding of who we are. Obviously, how we fit into the world, what this thing called consciousness is. So what I thought was interesting about your book, without this even being the purpose of your book, is that you shatter some of the paradigms that are most prevalent within that UFO community. For example, let's start with the whole origin of the ET phenomenon. There's this debate. Did the ETs arrive in 1947 with the explosion of the nuclear bomb and then the crash at Roswell? Is this a recent phenomenon? What would your over 1,000 first-person accounts tell us about answering that question, the when question, in terms of this phenomenon? And she says, I think, for a majority of the people that I interviewed, their opinion is they've always been here, the ETs, that it's not a new phenomenon. They have been visiting Earth for many, many eons. One person said before the beginning of time, when he was telling me some of the ancient stories, he said, these stories go back before the beginning of time. They are the old, old stories. Of course, I don't include those in the book, but what he says, what he was saying to me is that this is nothing new. We've always had interaction with the people from the stars. But I also met other people from different tribes who had no connection or no stories that were related to that. It would appear that depending upon the tribal group, that they were verified. I don't know if you read it, but one story, the young man who told me about his grandfather, who, when he was young, helped bury an alien in the desert. And this was way before Roswell. No, I don't remember the story. Well, the young man who told me about his grandfather that buried the alien along with some other teenaged boys, that they found him wandering in the desert and he died. And they just buried him and never told anyone. They considered that the star people to be messengers from the sky gods, and so they buried him. It's just a totally different kind of relationship that we're talking about here. And Alex says another aspect of the ET UFO phenomenon that we're constantly trying to get our arms around. Once you cross the chasm and say, okay, there is something here that we need to study and we need to understand. So all the rest is kind of silly then to ignore this. Are we talking about a nuts and bolts phenomenon, meaning flying saucers and vehicles and beings? Or are we talking about a consciousness phenomenon? In other words, interdimensional or mind control, dream kind of phenomena? Or is it both? What does your research tell you? And Dr. Artie Sixkiller responds and says, I think it's a combination of both. I've found that to be present, particularly in some of the Maya stories, that traveling back and forth between dimensions, for instance. In fact, sometimes I think when I was listening to some of the Mayan elders that probably the Mayans were the first-time travelers, because they seemed to have that ability, or at least that knowledge of how to travel back and forth. But then Black Hawk also had that ability, the great Sioux medicine man. I think most of the stories that are recorded in my book These were the nuts and bolts kinds of things. What I find is most interesting about them is that they weren't channeling somebody. They weren't under hypnosis. They were telling stories as they remembered them. They were not under some kind of hypnotic spell. They were telling the stories that were passed down to them from generations. Now let's touch on the potential agenda here, Alex says, which is speculative and a tricky topic to even approach. I was listening to a presentation the other day by a UFO researcher, Barbara Lamb, who's done regression therapy work with over 1,000 people and who claim to have had contact with aliens. She, like many others, has the distinct impression that there's some kind of interbreeding, a hybridization process going on here. Do you have any thoughts on that? And Dr. Artie Sixkiller says, I had no stories of that among American Indians. But I did encounter it in Mexico and in Guatemala, of women who claim to have been abducted and to have born hybrid children. I had one young woman tell me the story that she had been in the plaza one evening with her boyfriend and her friends, and she was 16 at the time. And she said that they were walking back home and both of them were taken, and so on. She said she realized the next day that she was pregnant, but she had never had sex. So she and her boyfriend decide that it's a virgin birth, like the Virgin Mary, and they were very devout Catholics, so he decides that he has to marry her, because if he marries her, there will be no one in the village to criticize them. A few weeks later, as the ceremony is being planned, she's abducted again, she said, where she wakes up the next day and she's no longer pregnant. Of course, those kinds of accounts directly relate to so many accounts that other UFO researchers like John Mack at Harvard, Bud Hopkins, and just many, many other credible UFO researchers have found the same things. It's interesting that you've run across that as well. I ran across more than one case. I had a wonderful guide who knew what I was doing, and he was taking me to these different sites. Actually, back when I was about 15 years old, a librarian handed me this book called Incidents of Travel in the Yucatan. It was by two 19th century explorers by the name of Stevens and Catherwood. They had heard rumors of these great cities in the jungles of Mexico and Central America that had been built, and they went there in search of them. Of course, the book chronicles their trip, and I had promised myself when I was a teenager that one day I was going to follow in their footsteps and go to all these ancient cities. And the years passed, and making a living and getting my degree took the forefront of my dream. But the day I retired, I was coming home, and I saw a yard sale with a bunch of books stacked up against a garage door. Now, I couldn't pass this up, so I stopped my car. And here I found one of those old books by Stevens, and I thought, this is something that I must do. And so she was interested in following up not only on Stevens and Catherwood, but also finding out firsthand the experiences of modern-day Maya with UFOs. Now, the Maya call these sky gods, and so that's what she had set out to do. Now, yet when you read UFO literature about the cigar-shaped craft, and here they are describing it as a gasoline tank, because that's what they've seen in their environment, so that's also very interesting. Yes, it speaks to all the cultural flavoring that we imagine goes on in these accounts, especially when we look at the older accounts. Finally, what I want to talk about is spirituality. If we unpack these experiences with American Indians that you're talking about, we assume, going in, that there's a different spiritual orientation. I mean, you're in your professional career at Montana State University. You have to walk a fine line like we all do. You can't walk around and say, Oh, of course I believe in spirit communication and talking with the dead. In fact, everyone I know just assumes that that's a truth. We have this kind of cultural barrier in the West, regardless of any kind of religious background we may have in terms of talking about and experiencing spirituality. I think we assume, whether this is true or not, and maybe you can tell me if it is, that in American Indian cultures there's a different set of givens. In other words, a different orientation regarding the spirit world. Is this true? Is that a misconception? How might that play into these accounts and someone's receptivity to this kind of experience? And Dr. Artie Sixkiller says she thinks, again, that you have to look at the separate tribes. There are some tribes that it's forbidden to even speak the name of a dead person. Where in other tribes they believe that when someone dies, they stay with them for a year. Their spirit remains with them for a year, and then after a year they hold a ceremony to release that person. And they can speak with those who have passed on. So it depends on the tribal group. And it varies greatly throughout the United States and Alaska. So it's difficult for me to say that this is a general rule, that it has a spiritual connection. But definitely it does with some of the tribes. There's no question about it. Some of the tribes actually talk, and the Maya do this too. They talk about the trip across the Milky Way, that when you die you cross the path of the Milky Way. And see, that's what the Maya believe. They talk about going to Xbalba. You've got a common theme there, that the cosmos plays so much a part in afterlife and death. I think that the native people on a whole are accepting of this. They aren't skeptical of it. So if you approach it from a perspective that it is part of the universe and that it's nothing to fear, then that's one view. But to be skeptical of it and not believe what you've seen, or even to deny that it occurs, is a totally different worldview. It's a worldview that is so prevalent in our society and our culture. And when you deconstruct it, a USO perspective, but from a straight scientific perspective, don't you think that comes from the fact that modern day society is so controlled by the scientific evidence of everything, where in the native community it is not? I think that's somewhat of a misdirect, because I think that the best scientific evidence that we have for the last 100 years, all the best scientific evidence in quantum physics has pointed us in the other direction, and that we've just chosen to ignore it. Because the materialism that is so much a part of capitalism, and the thing that we live in, that we love, and our computers and all that pulls us the other way. So we can't possibly imagine what it would mean to give all that up. So we hold on to what's familiar. It has all sorts of other implications as well, of course. I guess we are coming to that point that maybe there is some reality to when people have an orientation where they're free from that baggage, that they can look at this and go, I'm not sure, I don't know that happened. But it does relate to these other stories that I've heard in my past, so perhaps it's true. It isn't as hard to accept. Does that make it easier for them to incorporate it into their life without getting totally whacked out or traumatized? I absolutely believe that's true, because I've found very little evidence of trauma among the people of the native people that I've interviewed. I never sat down and really took each story and put it in a category, but I think there was one instance I pointed out in the book where the young woman had an encounter and she had witnessed. Therefore, she really had difficulty dealing with it, and she dropped out of school. Okay. But rarely do I encounter trauma with these experiences with Native people. So, this is, I just want to say that I think that, as some of the accounts, of course, and from my understanding of, from the elders, that this is a very common experience, as are many other experiences, types with spirits and various beings. It's part of an accepted way, and not something to be fearful of, that these are our relatives, as we say, the Wukchapi Oyate are our relatives, part of the greater cosmic family, universal family, and that often, there was, these things were kept hidden from other cultures, from other people, from those that came around poking around, and archaeologists, anthropologists, and poking around the people, First Nations people, to find out, like specimens, poking around them like specimens. And these things were kept secret, they were kept hidden. And certainly you can understand why, because you're talking about alien beings, you're talking about spiritual beings, you're talking about that realm that is so much a part of First Nations people throughout the whole world, through their ceremonies and their spiritual practices and their ancient knowledge and wisdom. So yes, they kept it secret. They didn't talk about these things. And but now they're talking about this. Many of them are talking about it because of the prophecies coming true too. So I'm going to close here with just about this little piece here. It's getting down to the wire, that Native First Nations wisdom is very deep and profound, but it's simple and it's true, and it has passed the test of time. It's the wisdom of the elders. It's very pertinent to the times in which we are now living. Had the rest of the world lived according to the philosophy of the Earth Keepers, or the people of the Earth, we would not be facing the dreadful problems that now we are experiencing in the ways of pollution, climate change, and so on. Now, I just want to finish with this prayer from Black Elk, who was Oglala. And the words of the great holy man Black Elk, he says, the first peace, which is the most important, is that which comes within the souls of people. When they realize their relationship, their oneness with the universe and all of its powers. And when they realize that at the center of the universe dwells the Great Spirit, and that this center is really everywhere, that this center, it is within each of us. So I want to just finish with beautiful words from the holy man Black Elk, and thank you so much for staying tuned here with me today and going on this little bit of exploration here. And I hope that something that I've shared with you today has touched your heart spirit and got you thinking, I guess, hopefully. And I will see you next Monday at the same time. I want to thank Tracy for helping me out here, getting me on. Trace Ellum.